Thank you.
Leader Willis moves for the adoption of floor amendment number 2 to Senate Bill 1966. All those in favor say aye. All opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and floor amendment 2 is adopted. Mr. Clerk,
Floor amendment number 3 is offered by Representative Willis and has been approved for consideration.
Representative Willis on the amendment.
Floor Amendment 3 is just correcting a drafting error. When we put in Floor Amendment 2, we accidentally left out the underlying requirements for person-person transfers that are required to go through a federal firearms dealer on that. So that's what we're dealing with.
Are there questions on the amendment number 3? Seeing none, Representative Willis moves to adopt floor amendment number 3 to Senate Bill 1966. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and floor amendment number 3 is adopted. Mr. Clerk?
No further amendments, but a housing note as sent by the Senate has been requested, not filed at this time.
Leader Willis, do you wish to renew your motion?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion that all outstanding notes are considered inapplicable, please, at this time.
Representative Wheeler?
Inquiry the chair again, as far as how many notes are outstanding?
Mr. Clerk?
The housing note as introduced in the House is still outstanding.
Okay, well, still object based on that one motion. Roll call vote is requested.
Leader Willis has moved to rule the notes inapplicable. This is a roll call vote, members. Those in favor vote aye. All opposed vote nay. The voting is open. Have all voted who wish? Have all voted who wish? Have all voted who wish? Mr. Clerk, please take the record. 62 voting in favor, 52 voting against, 0 voting present. The notes are held inapplicable. Mr. Clerk.
No further motions.
Representative Willis. Oh, excuse me, third reading. Mr. Clerk, please read the bill.
Senate Bill 1966, Bill for enacting criminal law, third reading the Senate bill.
Representative Willis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This bill has come about as a response to an unfortunate tragedy that we saw a few months ago, which brought to light a number of loopholes that were in our FOID system. Prior to that, we also had seen some studies that were done by the Johns Hopkins Institute and the Webster Group that showed that we had some deficiencies in the state of Illinois. These deficiencies do not, in my opinion, take away anybody's Second Amendment rights. What they do is they realize that we've got some work to do in the state of Illinois to make sure that firearms are only owned by law-abiding citizens, those people that have a right to own those firearms. And so as a result of a working group where we had a number of people come together, and we started with people on both sides of the issue, and unfortunately we had to bring it down to those that we were going to make sure that we got what was our best thing in here. We worked extensively with the state police, with other law enforcement, and we also worked specifically with the Aurora Police Department, who were unfortunately caught up in the results of what had happened by having inefficient areas in our FOID system. And so we took all of those things to mind, and we came up with what we consider a good bill that does not take away anybody's Second Amendment rights. So what the bill does, it modernizes our FOID Act. FOID has been around since the 70s. It has never been increased in the cost. It has never been really modernized. It's been the same system all the time. People put in their name and their address, request to get a FOID card, pay a $10 fee. They do a cursory check of their background. Nothing pops up. The state police issue you your FOID card. Well, we have found that there's some deficiencies in that. Oftentimes people change their names. Oftentimes, believe it or not, people lie on their FOID cards when they apply for it. So we have found that really, truly, the best way that we can take care of this is we can make it modernized. So we've done a couple of things. We've shortened the time for a FOID card from 10 years to 5 years. We are requiring fingerprints. Fingerprints don't lie. When you submit your fingerprints, we know who you are, where you're from. It doesn't matter what you've put on there. We're going to make sure that we have an adequate check of not only the state of Illinois' database for felonies, but also national databases, so that we can make sure that we're correcting and not having the wrong people have a firearms owner identification card. We also found that there was insufficiencies in the data that was shared with law enforcement, and that is something that we need to correct. And so what we're trying to do is making sure that this portal is most up-to-date and user-friendly for all law enforcement, so that they can have the correct information available, so that they can know as they're doing checks that they're making sure that we only, again, have the correct people owning firearms and having them throughout the state of Illinois. We also knew that there were some problems in the courts. The unfortunate incidents with the Aurora shooter, he was in front of court a number of times and nobody caught that he had a revocation before him. And so we have gone and clarified and made this portal much more easier for the courts to be able to do it. We also found that there was a loophole that could often be used, what is called a person-to-person transfer of firearms. And not always, while it is strongly suggested that a background check is done as those transfers are done, it's not always being done. And so we want to make sure that we have a firearms dealer, a licensed dealer that is going and facilitating those transfers so that we can get rid of any loopholes on those checks not being done. These are the things that we think need to be done. Well, unfortunately, it takes money to have this be done, and that is why it is recommended in here that we increase the FOID card cost. When we are dealing with over 10,000 FOID cards annually being revoked for a number of reasons, we need to make sure that we give the state police the resources and the ability to do their job appropriately. By increasing the FOID card cost, we can go and give them the money and the resources to do their job, to make sure that we do not have miscommunication and tragedies like we saw in Aurora just recently. This is something that needs to be done. It needs to make sure that we take care of all of this in the most efficient way possible so that all members of law enforcement are safe. They need to be safe if they need to do a revocation. They need to have as much information as possible, and that's what we've put into this with many talks with the state police, local law enforcement, and gun owners as we're going through. Fingerprinting is nothing new to this world that we have today. We do fingerprinting on a lot of levels. Many people, when they apply for various jobs, are required to submit fingerprints. We have fingerprinting when you go and you open up a checking account. You can be asked if you want to have a fingerprint to verify your check. That gets done. Some people do fingerprints on their iPads or their computers. There's a variety of things that we do that. This chamber, in fact, required fingerprinting for people that work with children. We've done that to make sure that we have correct background checks, that we are protecting our children. Well, another way we can protect our children is making sure that the wrong people do not own firearms. And that's going to be requiring fingerprints for all firearm owners. One of the things that we've took into consideration is that once you do this, your fingerprints are on file. You do not need to repeatedly do that. and we're taking that into consideration. So if you chose to put in fingerprints to speed up your concealed carry license when you did that a number of years ago and we have it on file, you're good. You don't need to redo it again. We're making sure that we're trying to make this as easy as possible to allow those members, those people that are lawfully own their guns to continue to do that. There are fingerprinting in other states right now that have no problems with it. It's been able to do. Hawaii, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., New York, Connecticut, and Texas require fingerprinting. So with that, I'm sure the other side of the aisle has a lot of questions. I will save the rest of my stuff to answer their questions as we go forward, but I do request an aye vote. Thank you.
Members, as we move into debate, we will be using a 5-minute timer. Every member who seeks recognition will be recognized. This is a very an issue that many people feel passionately about. We'll have a thorough debate on it, but I ask you to please be respectful. Representative Welch for an announcement.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Please let the record reflect that Representative Joyce Mason is excused for the remainder of the day.
Thank you. Representative Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
She indicates she will.
Thank you. Representative Willis, thank you for making your presentation today. I have a little bit different recollection of how this all kind of unfolded. So with your indulgence, I'd like to kind of go through what my recollection of the process in this was. So help me with, I think everyone knows, but maybe for those who are not here, what started, what was there there was an action or a tragedy here in the state that kind of started this conversation? Could you remind us what that was?
Well, actually, this was originally started from the report that came out from Johns Hopkins Institute on some ways that we could clean up our FOID card. It got brought to the head and probably put into a much more urgent issue as a result of the Henry Pratt shooting in Aurora.
In Aurora. So that's what I remember, is that there was an investigation done after the Aurora shooting, after the tragedy there, and there were some deficiencies found in some of what transpired in the time that that shooter applied for the ability to get a concealed carry license and all of that. And I have the timeline for that if we need to go through it. But just remembering that, I know that you wanted to put a working group together. And my recollection was that Leader Durkin then asked several of the members from our side of the aisle to be a part of that working group. And there were 4 members. So in putting the working group together at our first meeting, we had some legislators, some legislative staff, from both sides of the aisle. We had some gun rights advocates. As I recall, there was one advocate that wanted to be there that was excluded. There were some representatives on the phone from GPAC and maybe another organization. And we had some law enforcement members there from the state and some local level, including Aurora. At that time, you presented a list of 12 items that I believe that were put together. They were some GPAC requests, and in that meeting, we looked at those, and one of the main issues on that list was fingerprinting. I think you may remember or recall that during that meeting, we gave a pretty strong objection to the idea of fingerprinting otherwise law-abiding citizens for exercising a Second Amendment right, and even said that that particular point could be a non-starter for us, and if that was what this was all about, we probably weren't going to be able to go any further with our conversations. Do you recall that?
I do, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So as we reviewed the list, we were then kind of tasked with trying to decide of those points which ones maybe we could find some common ground on, and we scheduled this, at least the idea of having ongoing meetings. And then we had a second meeting. I want to say at that first meeting, I believe that you assured me that there was, that the impetus of this was not ultimately to make sure that we got fingerprinting for those otherwise law-abiding citizens who had done nothing else wrong except want to exercise their Second Amendment right.
Well, I think what I probably assured you was that was not the only reason to be behind this, that we were looking at the FOID card revocation issuance as a whole. What I think came out of that meeting, just as your group stated that fingerprinting was a non-negotiable, it came from the other side that they felt very strongly that fingerprinting needed to be part of the package as we continued on.
Okay, but at that point, we were still talking.
We were.
And arranged to have a second meeting. At the
we did.
second meeting, I recall we had legislators there, law enforcement, and some staff, and the gun rights advocates were not there, and neither were the those in opposition for, or those who were supporting the GPAC 12-pointer. That's right?
We had some
Okay.
smaller meetings as we went forward.
Yeah,
yes,
because it
mostly
became
with
evident at that meeting
legislators.
that there had been
Excuse
some
me,
other meetings.
Representative Bryant, your time has expired, but your seatmate has sought recognition. I'm wondering if Representative Severin is seeking to yield time to you.
Absolutely, thank you.
All right, 5 more minutes for Representative Bryant.
Thank you. So we had a second meeting. In that second meeting, the 12 points again were kind of brought forward, and we did talk about the possibility of, I believe we talked about the possibility of perhaps offering up fingerprinting, provided that that was an option similar to CCL, where it would maybe just speed up the processing. But the conversations were ongoing, and I left there kind of feeling like we were in a good place. Did you feel like that at the end of the second meeting?
I do. I think
Okay.
that we continue to have open communication through the entire process, ma'am.
Thank you. So I left the meeting then thinking that we were going to have another meeting, and then within about 24 hours, House Bill 96 was filed, which ultimately had, if not all, at least the majority of those 12 points that we had discussed in bill form. You and I had a telephone conversation about that, and you indicated that you did not intend to move that bill forward, that we were going to go ahead and have continuing conversations.
I did.
Is that accurate?
I reached out and made a phone call to you directly to make sure that you knew that I did not intend to have our conversation stopped at that time.
Okay, so let's talk about what was in House Bill 96, even though that is not the bill we're looking at today, but there are still major elements in today's bill that are a part of that. You've amended it, and so we'll talk about those amendments as well. So House Bill 96 and those elements that still remain would have been an increase in the FOID card. That particular bill was taking FOID from $10 for 10 years to 100. So I'm going to use 10 years as the comparison, so we're comparing apples to apples. So it would be from now $10 to $100 over 10 years, which is a 1,000% increase. The bill that we're seeing today has been amended, so that is now $20 for 5 years, which is $40 per 10 years. So we're still talking about a 400% increase as compared to what someone is paying today for a FOID card. Is that right?
Well, ma'am, what I would bring out to your attention, if we adjusted for inflation when the $10 was put in originally in the 70s, or $5 where it went, in 1968, and now with inflation going through, current inflation would say that today's card would be $38.
So, okay, so you agree that it's a 400% increase.
Well, math doesn't lie. I
Okay.
can't argue
Okay.
with you on that.
So 400% increase. Just curious, Do we have any other constitutionally, a constitutional right for which we charge? And if we do, have we
Well,
had a 400% increase on that particular Second Amendment, or on that particular constitutional right?
I would say if you want to consider the right to leave our country, a cost of a passport is in there, and the current cost
Passport's
of
a constitutional right?
Well, the right to free travel, if you want to consider that. I mean,
What-
it's not
well,
necessarily written in
which
the
amendment?
Constitution.
What, could you, I'm not familiar with that constitutional amendment. What number is that?
It's not necessarily in an amendment, but I would say the right to travel certainly would go under right to move around or whatever, so that you're not held captive, if you want to go that
All
way.
right, I'll get with your staff later and find out which constitutional amendment says I can travel. Okay, so, all right, so going on then, we also were moving the timeline from 10 years to 5. In our conversations with the state police, do you remember them saying that one of their major objections was going from 10 years to 5? Because the reason we moved it from 5 to 10 was because they were having trouble processing them at the 5. They didn't have the staff to do it, and they specifically said, can we not change it to 5 years? And so I'm wondering what led to changing this then over their objections.
Well, I think that they realized that it would be much more efficient to do it that way, and at this point, the state police are totally on board with the 5-year time on it. It makes it consistent with concealed carry licenses.
So in my conversations with them, the conversations were mostly that they need money, and they don't really care because they need the money. So
No,
they're looking to get the infusion of money here. So let's be clear about that.
Representative Bryant, your time has expired, but Representative Marin is seeking recognition. Do you wish to yield your time to Representative Bryant?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to yield my 5 minutes to Representative Bryant.
Okay, 5 more minutes, Representative Bryant.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the cost of this again. So in the in House Bill 96, the original legislation, we also have in this legislation, so this is the same, we have an issue of a background check and fingerprinting. However, in this bill, you made clear in your amendments that you are limiting the amount of cost that the vendor that is taking the fingerprints can charge. So with that being said, so we're actually at an expense, even with those changes, we're back up to a minimum expense over the 10 years of roughly $100. So we're going from 10 back to 100, which takes us to 1,000% increase again on the cost of an otherwise law-abiding citizen exercising their Second Amendment right guaranteed by the Constitution.
Well, the one thing you're not putting into consideration, the fingerprinting is a one-time charge. Not every person will need to get fingerprinted if they already have their fingerprints on file from a concealed carry license. They will not need to redo those fingerprints. So fingerprinting is a one-time charge. So I don't think that really works quite right in your figures.
So currently, do you know how many percentage of current FOID card holders have their fingerprints on file?
Not off the top of my head.
Well, let me
I'm
help
sure
you then.
we can get that for
It's
you.
roughly 0.06% of FOID card holders. So
Well-
basically everyone, right, almost everyone, except for the 0.06% who have theirs on file right now, will have to be fingerprinted?
I'm sorry, ma'am, I missed your question.
It's not really a question. I'm just saying that there's 0.06% of present FOID card holders have their fingerprints on file. So basically, almost everyone who presently has a FOID card right now is going to have to be fingerprinted. So let's talk about fingerprinting for just a second. In committee, a question was asked about fingerprinting, and the question was if you supported universal fingerprinting. Do you remember what your answer was to that?
I said if it makes it a safer state, I am in support of anything that makes our state safer.
Okay, so I just want to make sure the body is listening right now. I want to make sure the body is listening right now. So, all due respect to my colleague on the other side of the aisle, the statement was that she's okay with universal fingerprinting. Okay with universal fingerprinting. Every citizen of this state, it would be okay to fingerprint them. Otherwise, legal citizens doing nothing illegal, but it would be okay to fingerprint them. So just let that sink in for just a little bit. Okay, going on. So we know that there were some deficiencies identified after the investigation from the tragedy in Aurora. I think every gun owner in this state wants to make sure that we are doing it legally and that we're keeping our citizens safe. The whole objective is to get the bad guys off the street and the ones who don't have a legal right to own them. We want to make sure that they no longer can do that. So I don't know if you're aware that Representative Wheeler, are you aware that Representative Wheeler has filed a bill that kind of goes at this from from the backside to address the issues that were identified in Aurora? That's House Bill 3839. Are you aware of that?
I am aware of his bill, ma'am.
Okay. And in his case, do you, or in that bill's case, do you know what the status of that bill is?
I believe it's in rules.
In the Senate? It's in rules?
I honestly don't know, ma'am.
Okay. But we do have a bill.
Okay, so it's in assignments in the Senate then.
Okay. So we actually do have a bill that is that is current and that we could actually pass in this legislative session that does address the issues that we found from the tragedy in Aurora without infringing on our citizens' Second Amendment rights.
Well, with all due respect to the representative that filed the bill, I do believe there are some major deficiencies in that bill that did not address many of the concerns that were brought up from the Joyce Foundation when they did a study of FOID card holders.
Oh,
Representative Bryant, your time is drawn to a close again. Representative Demmer wishes to yield his 5 minutes to you.
thank you.
Not to mention, there is no funding in his bill to actually be able to do the things that he feels are necessary.
Okay, so but we still have time to take the real issues and we could work on some funding mechanisms. So I just want to make sure
Ma'am, if
everyone
that bill
understands that this
came
isn't
over
the
from
end all
the
to beat all
Senate,
right here today.
That bill is currently in the Senate. I have no control on when that bill will move from the Senate over to the House.
If it did, if they were working on that in the Senate and it moved over to the House, would that be something that you think you could support?
I would certainly look at the bill much closer and try to be able to support it if I could.
Okay, let me just move on really quickly. In our conversations and in committee, it was stated that immediately, if this bill passes, immediately it will be litigated. We know. Do you know that there's outstanding? There is an outstanding litigation right now that's going to be going to the Supreme Court that actually may wipe out the FOID card in Illinois totally. And should that happen, basically the work on this bill will totally go away. But in fact, the bill that Representative Wheeler has actually would stand up to constitutional scrutiny. And I just want to make sure that the body here knows that today. I'm not going to take too much more time with this bill because I think there are some other speakers that are going to speak on this as well. I just want to highlight a couple to the bill. There's a couple things I want to highlight I think will also be brought up with some other speakers coming along. This bill does absolutely nothing to address the very real issues identified in the tragedy of Aurora. There has been another study that's mentioned, but the driving force behind this was to fix what happened in Aurora so that we can all get beyond what those problems were. It creates a real question of constitutionality, will absolutely be litigated and struck down, causing a delay in addressing the real issues that have been identified. 3, it divides a constitutionally guaranteed right into 2 categories: those who can afford it and those who cannot afford it. It opens a wide door to requiring fingerprinting, to exercise a constitutional right, and by the sponsor's own testimony in committee encourages universal fingerprinting. It redirects valuable dollars, which a point we didn't even get to yet in the amendment, takes money away from IDNR, $2 million a year. So over that 20-year period, $20 million a year from IDNR that is directed to the conservation police that should be used to make sure that our state parks are managed and properly taken care of. It also sets a fee limit for private businesses, creates an unenforceable requirement for local law enforcement to confiscate private property, and also allows for them to enter private homes. This is a bad bill. The attempt at this from the beginning was applaudable. We can probably get to a place where even members like me, who usually oppose almost all of these, I think we could get to a place where we can find common ground. I would like to work on the bill that Representative Wheeler has presented. We can do it over on the Senate side with our friends and allies over there and bring it over here, but this is not the bill. Friends, I urge a no vote today to protect the constitutional rights of our citizens in this state and to ensure that when the Supreme Court rules that the FOID card in Illinois is not constitutional and wipes it out, we don't waste this valuable time addressing the issues that have been identified in the tragedy that happened in Aurora. I urge a no vote.
Okay, may I respond to a couple of those last things, Madam Speaker?
Yes, you may.
Okay, so FOID cards were put in 1968. To date, they have not been found unconstitutional. In fact, they have been upheld through many challenges. Fingerprinting, there are a number of cases that have gone before the courts regarding the constitutionality of fingerprinting. One is Gong versus Bloomberg. Again, it did not violate the Second Amendment right to do fingerprinting. Same thing in Heller versus District of Columbia on the fingerprinting requirement of a gun registrations in 2015. So while I believe that gun owners and gun right advocates
Representative, excuse me, Representative Bryan had spoken to the bill, so I was in error in allowing you. I'm sure you'll be able to get your points in with another speaker.
Problem.
Mr. Clerk, rules report.
Committee reports. Representative Greg Harris, Chairperson Committee on Rules, reports following action on May 29, 2019. Rex adopted for the floor is Floor Amendment 2 to House Bill 97, Floor Amendment 4 to Senate Bill 220, Floor Amendment 3 to Senate Bill 1854.
Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
She will.
Thank you. Before we begin, Madam Speaker, I want to go to the point you made early on before the debate began about decorum. And I'd like to personally thank the sponsor for the many discussions, as well as some important changes that were made to the bill based on those discussions. I thank you for that. I also want to take a moment and thank James Hartman from House Dem staff for your hard work on this, and most importantly for Jen Passwater and all of our House Republican staff who have put in many hours on this issue, a lot of good discussions, and I thank you for your help and your friendship. Looking at this bill and how it began, I know my colleague had outlined kind of the path it took, and I know this came out of Aurora, and Aurora is a very sensitive issue for me. And I was really looking forward to getting to a place where we would all land together. We didn't quite reach that in this bill. I was hoping we'd get a little more balance. I do appreciate those discussions. So let me ask a couple of questions about my concerns about the bill that's on the board right now. The requirements for fingerprinting, the requirement or the restrictions on the cost of what a fingerprint can cost to a taxpayer, or actually in this case to somebody who's applying for a FOID card under the language in the bill, along with the restriction on the cost of what an FFL can charge in a transfer, are things I believe were mentioned in committee that would probably be challenged almost immediately in court if this bill were to become law and after being signed by the governor. Do you recall that discussion in committee?
I do recall that discussion.
So let me bring this idea to you here on the floor. I think when it comes to public safety, and we both want improved public safety.
Yes, sir.
When it comes to public safety, I would implore us all in this case to let's start with the things we can agree upon and run that part first. This bill reaches into other places that really don't have a direct connection to what happened in Aurora. It may have connections to a study that you had found, and I can understand and appreciate that. But some of the pieces of this particular bill don't do that. So I bring that up because one of the things that's very important to me is that we fix what happened with respect to a revoked FOID card. What happened in Aurora was done by a person who had a revoked FOID card. We've discussed this many times. To me, that's where we should begin in this process. All of us agree that someone who's had their privileges revoked for reasons that are already on the books should not have their FOID card in their possession, and they should not have their weapons in their possession. That's the first part first. And my concern, the way I ask you those questions, Kathy, has to do with if this act is challenged in court, I would expect those making that challenge to object to the entire act, which then slows down the implementation of the rest of the bill as you put it forth. I have concerns about that. I have a public safety concern that we should take the first step first and run that. That's the major impetus why I filed the bill. I have a question for you. Actually, I want to make a comment. I'm glad you included an online database in this bill for prohibited persons, for use by law enforcement, for state's attorneys and judges, to use while those prohibited persons are actually in a courtroom or they're detained by law enforcement, so they know quickly and easily. They don't have to go search through a database of something else to find out if that person has a revoked FOID card and if they should be asked for it. Actually, that's the idea that credit goes to Leader Durkin for that. He brought that to our team here, and I think we brought that to the table. And again, I'm grateful that it was in the bill.
Actually, it came from one of the gun advocates that wasn't invited to the meeting that you and I both had a private meeting
Okay,
with.
first I had heard of it actually came from Leader Durkin in a totally separate conversation. So I guess like minds were getting together on that part of it. One of the most important elements of what you've put in this bill and in our discussions has to do with actually having a system in place that we don't have right now. Currently, if someone's FOID card is revoked, the process, as I understand, and correct me if you see a difference in this, a letter is sent from the Illinois State Police to local law enforcement. Another letter is also sent to the revoked FOID card holder, and that's pretty much where the system stops right now, as far as what happens bureaucratically within the state of Illinois. There's no follow-up. Would you care to comment on that?
No, you're correct. It's very permissive.
So consequently, the idea of placing and assigning responsibility for that process to an entity is in your bill, and I think we agreed on the idea that the Illinois State Police is the proper place for that to occur.
Representative, your time is closed, but Representative Reich, do you wish to yield your time to Representative Wheeler? 5 more minutes, Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The idea of creating this Illinois State Police Task Force who's responsible for weapon recovery with the assistance of local law enforcement is something that the state police had agreed to in your discussions with them, correct?
Correct.
And it's important to also note that the local law enforcement who may be involved at their discretion in this recovery process, they need to be reimbursed for their activities and their efforts.
That is the whole idea behind the Firearm Revocation Fund.
Correct. Pointing to that then, there's a cost involved in that process. We don't know necessarily, to my knowledge yet, what that cost would be per situation, per the whole element of what's involved in that. Do you have any estimate at all?
Well, I have an estimate that was given to me on the total cost of the FOID program, and that is broken down into what it cost using the estimation of the 2.4 million FOID card holders out there, and it's broken down to approximately $20.74 to enforce the program as stated.
But as it currently exists, the enforcement element of a revoked FOID card comes down to 2 letters and 2 envelopes and 2 stamps.
Well, it also does making sure that the database is up and all of
I
that
agree with
stuff
that part.
too.
I'm talking about just the recovery process once a FOID card holder's privileges have been revoked.
Revocation, yes.
I'm sorry?
For what we're doing on revocations, that is the only cost that is right now 100% in there. And then depending upon if they actually do those that come up to the top of the batch that are considered clear and present danger. And we do have revocations where they do have people that are going out to homes to actually enforce this now.
My understanding is those are local law enforcement efforts, not necessarily Illinois State Police efforts.
Well, we've seen in the
There may be a
case in-
combination, but
There's a combination. I mean, there was a task force that, again, had another tragedy in Rockford when they were trying to work together on stuff. It wasn't just a
right,
revocation.
that was a federal warrant, right?
was a
This is, I
different-
believe.
right.
This is a little different. So what I'm trying to get to is there has to be some kind of an understanding of what a program like this is going to cost as we begin to figure out how that should be implemented. The Chicago Tribune published an article, I want to say late last week, that points to the fact that there are potentially tens of thousands of revoked FOID cards in the state that have not been recovered by law enforcement. You aware of that?
34,000 Illinoisans have lost their right to own a gun. Nearly 80% of them may still be armed.
I am pointing to that article for a reason. Because when we fund a very, very important initiative like what you've outlined in this Illinois State Police Task Force, responsible for recovering FOID cards, responsible for recovering weapons that potentially could exist. We don't know that. That's an estimate from our friends at the Chicago Tribune. The idea, in my mind, of saying we're going to take an amount of money from a FOID card and hope that's enough isn't enough. That's something as a public safety measure as a state, I believe we should appropriate from public safety funds through general revenue or some other source we can find. I don't see a path, because I don't understand the cost part of it yet, but in my imagination, as best I can make it, I don't see how what we're taking in this bill and moving into that recovery fund is actually going to be able to be enough to do that in year 1 or 2 or 3.
Well, I think what the argument would be is we do have general revenue funds and operating costs that the state police already have. We are hoping that it is enough, and once they get caught up, we don't know, and you're right. And that was why we came with $50 as the initial cost, hoping that that would go, but we weren't able to get that accepted by everybody, and so we're trying to do that. Also, one of the things, our previous governor swept $4 million out of the state police funds. So we're dealing with that right now also.
No, I understand that. I'm bringing this to the point, though, because the reason why I filed the bill that I filed has to do with the fact that I think that is a public safety initiative that protects the entire state. Most FOID card holders, based on the fact that there's 2.4 million of them, and we have a category of revocations in the 10,000 area.
Representative, your time is drawn to a close. Representative Kiker, do you seek recognition to yield your time?
I do. I yield my time to Representative Wheeler.
Please proceed, Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Where I was trying to go here has to do with these costs aren't going to be balanced based on what's taken from the FOID card fees. We don't necessarily charge more in a driver's license to try and catch up with the fact that there's a speeding epidemic in the state of Illinois. This, to me, is a public safety issue. We should treat it as such. We should ask state police for a budget number to apply to what they believe they need to run these task forces. That's why in the bill that I filed, I actually printed it that way instead of having a revocation fund. And I want to point out one other thing while we're talking about this. In Amendment 1 to this bill, when it was $50 for 5 years for the entire cost of the FOID, we had $15 going to the State Police Revocation Enforcement Fund. In Amendment 2, when the total cost of the FOID card dropped down to $20 for 5 years, that number got moved down to $5 for the revocation fund. Now, how are the state police going to be able to do the same thing that they said they needed in Amendment 1 with the money allotted in Amendment 2?
They're going to have to set priorities on those that are clear and present danger. That's what's going to unfortunately happen. They won't be able to do everything that they want to. They will have to take out of their general operating expenses. And perhaps they'll come back to us asking for more appropriations to be able to continue to safely do revocations.
But Representative, you do believe that this is an important element of your bill, right? This is one of the most important parts of the bill,
Yes, I do.
which means that we should treat it as such, we should fund it as such, and we should expedite it as such. That is why I will still ask the body and you, the sponsor, to let's break these measures into two pieces. Do the revocation part of it, actually the recovery part based on revocation, as a separate measure that can be run with probably pretty wide bipartisan support in a way that will get this done. It will not be challenged in court, but for the other elements of the bill that some would consider to be an overreach.
You know, this is just mandating and putting into law what we're going to do the money from the FOID cards. This does not prevent the state police from doing their budget, and as we've passed our budget in the next couple of days, making sure that there is additional funding for the state police. Just like when we had to go and pull money from the Department of Natural Resources, we have gone and made them whole this year by finding money for them in the state budget, not from the FOID cards, but in the state budget.
My point to you, Representative, is that this is effectively a random guess. It's based on what we feel we can get out of increased fees to law-abiding FOID card holders in order to fund something that is still a public safety measure that the entire state benefits from. I'm going to go to the bill, Madam Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, the bill on the board is not the only path we have forward to affect better public safety when it comes to the firearms owner identification card in the state of Illinois. It is not the only measure we have to improve public safety when it comes to those issues in the state of Illinois. I filed a bill in the House, I believe it's being picked up also in the Senate, that will take the first step first. It doesn't reach too far. It will, I believe, not be challenged in court. It is something that would take effect more quickly and depend on those of us in this body and in the Senate to appropriate the appropriate amount of money for the first step, rather than waiting for money to roll in from FOID card renewals and applications. Could we improve the FOID card process? Should we improve the FOID card? Yes. There are things we could do, but we need to very carefully examine how we do that to respect the constitutional rights of all of our citizens. And wouldn't it make sense to do that part of it later, knowing that we've got a Supreme Court of the United States rendering a decision on a New York case, possibly next month, sometime this summer, that could provide some important guidance for how we should move forward in regarding how we reform the FOID card process. That makes more sense to me as someone who wants to see action sooner than later when it comes to how we deal with what happened in Aurora and what could happen anywhere in our state based on the fact that we have tens of thousands of FOID cards that have been revoked and not yet recovered. This time I respectfully request the body to vote no on this measure and look to another path. Thank you.
Representative Eunice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
She indicates she will.
Representative, am I correct? If your bill were to pass, is it accurate to say that there would be no more private transfers? If there are two FOID card owners that want to transfer their gun ownership from one FOID card owner to the other, they could no longer do that privately if this bill were to pass. Is that accurate?
That is correct, unless they are same members of the same family.
Okay,
They
thank
will
you.
be required to go to a federal firearms licensed dealer.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to the bill. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many reasons why I am opposed to this bill. And there are many reasons why I feel a no vote is the right vote. But I'm going to speak on one that I think everyone in this chamber should be in agreement on, and that's the one that I'm going to concentrate on it's based on the question that I just asked. And so we just heard the sponsor say that if her bill were to pass, the only way a legal gun owner can make a transfer is by going to a dealer, a licensed dealer. So ladies and gentlemen, I have the application. It is ATF Form 4473 from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And this is the form that a legal gun owner would have to fill out if they want to transfer to another legal gun owner. Looking at this, so for the record, let me just say, first of all, there's a lot of talk. Everybody knows there's a lot of talk about legalizing marijuana in Illinois. I, for one, am opposed to it. I will not be supporting it. But if it were to pass, if it were to be legalized, anyone that would legally then be using it would not be allowed to make a legal transfer of their gun. Because on this form, number 11E, it asks, and this is what every person would have to fill out, it asks, are you an unlawful user or addicted to marijuana or any depressant, stimulant, narcotic drug, or any other controlled substance? And then it says in bold print, in bold black print, it says, warning, the use or possession of marijuana remains unlawful under federal law, regardless of whether it has been legalized or decriminalized for medical or recreational purposes in the state where you reside. So because marijuana is federally illegal, and because if this bill were to pass, there would no longer be a lawful way for two law-abiding citizens to legally be able to privately transfer their gun ownerships. There would be no way for that law-abiding citizen to transfer, and no way for that law-abiding citizen to make a legal gun purchase of any kind. There would absolutely be no possible way, none, no possible way for someone who is a legal medical marijuana card holder or someone that wanted to, if the marijuana law should, if recreational use, which again is not something that I am for, but if that were to pass, there would be no way, absolutely no possible way, for that law-abiding citizen to either transfer or purchase a gun lawfully. And
Representative, your time has expired. Representative Ugaste is recognized.
I'll yield my time to Representative Eunice.
Okay, please proceed.
thank you, Representative Ugaste. And if someone were to falsify, if they went legally to the dealer, filled out this form, and were to falsify this form, that is a federal felony. So we are taking away the ability for an otherwise law-abiding citizen, a citizen that has done everything that they were asked to do according to the law. They've dotted every I, they've crossed every T, they've done everything that they were supposed to do, and we are taking that law-abiding citizen and turning that law-abiding citizen into criminals. Again, There are many reasons why you should vote no on this bill. But for that one in particular reason, nobody in this chamber should be supportive of that. Nobody in this chamber should be okay with knowingly turning that law-abiding citizen into a criminal. I urge a no vote.
Representative Skillicorn.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Will the member from DePage yield?
She indicates she will.
Thank you very much. Representative. So let's just start going to the bill right now, and I've pulled up the actual text of the bill here. And I just wanted to go to, say, page 11 of your bill, section 7 and 8. It talks about existing statute and giving the task force ability to enforce the FOID Act, Concealed Carry Act, and the Gun Dealer Licensing Act, correct?
Correct.
So let's go after the line of questioning from the member from Peoria. He was talking about the cannabis. So what happens if someone answers that 4473 questionnaire, and let's say they have a medical card, and they don't answer that question honestly? Will the task force go and revoke that person's FOID card and confiscate their weapons?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because one of the problems right now is that it is a federal law on cannabis use, whether it is medical or recreational. And so the loophole that is being touted as a lawful transaction is actually an illegal transaction under federal law. And so whether it is done through a private sale or a dealership sale, it is a violation of federal law.
Well, according to your bill, again, page 11, section 7 and 8, it empowers a task force to enforce the law. Will there be state troopers knocking down a door and confiscating weapons?
So the part of the responsibility of the task force is to prioritize the revocations and what they're doing as to putting those that are a clear and present danger. Somebody that is a medical marijuana user would not necessarily, by that alone, make them a clear and present danger.
Was Mr. Martin, the Aurora shooter, was he considered clear and present danger?
I honestly am not familiar with everything in there. I do know that he had a number of run-ins with the police, and I do believe that he probably would have been, if they knew that he had a firearm in his possession, he would have been up towards the top of a clear and present danger.
So let's go to page 10 of your bill. The current statute talks about information and data. So if we go to page 10, specifically the task force may develop and acquire information. Is there any limit on the data or information that this task force may acquire?
That's under the current violent crime and intelligence task force. So we did not change any language in that.
So you're telling me that you didn't change any language about acquiring information?
No, I did not change any language that is in the statute that you are referring to.
Okay. So I hear that Chicago has a criticized gang database. Does your bill prevent the state police or any of these task force from creating their own gang database?
It does not address gang databases at all.
It doesn't address it, but it doesn't change current law about data that is gathered.
This bill does not address gang databases.
So it does not eliminate any of these databases.
This bill does not address gang databases.
And it still empowers the task force to gather this information and create these databases.
The task force is already empowered under current law.
Where in this bill is the state police or one of these task forces prevented from creating registration or a registration system for firearms.
That is not addressed in this bill.
So it's not addressed, it's not
Would
prevented.
you like me to put a gun registry in this bill?
I would like something in this bill to prevent that.
It does not address it, therefore it does not allow it under this bill.
Is that your intent that it should not be prevented?
It does not address it in this bill.
Representative Skilcorn, your time has expired.
Who's ready?
Who's left to yield in time?
So we're willing to yield time?
Representative Welter, do you wish to yield your 5 minutes to Representative Skilcorn?
I do.
Okay, please proceed, Representative Skilcorn.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative, where in your bill is the state police prevented from requiring gun dealers to give up sales information if the task force wants it?
That is not addressed in this bill. I believe if you go back to my gun certification bill, there is some information in there that addresses that.
Is there any intent to prevent that or to gather data for how many sales are done in a month?
That is not addressed in this bill.
So let's go to page 8 of the bill. And
Sorry, what page?
Page 8.
Okay.
In the prohibited person portal. How would a citizen, how would one of our constituents get off that list?
I think it's more a concern of how one of your constituents get on that list.
You don't have concerns of due process of how someone might get off that list?
That is actually language that came from your leadership.
I am quite
prohibited
independent of any leadership. That's why I asked the question. All right, well, I'll go on to the next one here.
I will state that this is a database that is not openly available, and it is actually only for law enforcement personnel only. If it would be the same with anything else, if somebody was found that they were inadvertently put on there because of false data, they can certainly petition and request whoever put it on to clarify that if it was their name was wrong or something along those lines.
So your intent is that they can petition to get off this prohibited
I think
person
that's
portal?
just the way that whenever we have mistaken identities dealt with, that would be my intent, that they would be able to address that.
All right, next question I'm going to go to. There is a lawsuit right now here in Sangamon County where the state police denied someone a FOID card. The state police claimed it found a conviction, but it won't produce it. The involved individual has a FOID card for a number of years and says he's never been convicted of anything. Yet, what is the standard the state police have to prove?
Well, I think that is one of the things that will be easily clarified under fingerprints so that we can make sure that we don't have false accusations going out.
But then again, we go back to this database. You know, clearly the state police says that this is someone who has committed offense that deserves revocation of their FOID card, yet how do they get off that list?
The point behind the database is not to go and have a huge list of felons or unsavory people. It is to make sure that we have a much better portal of information sharing so that we can prevent tragedies that only one law enforcement agency knows and not letting those in other districts or in local places be aware of.
So you mentioned about due process and someone that would be able to petition to get removed from the list. Who pays for that? Are they supplied a public defender?
That is not addressed in there, and this is not what this is intended to do. Again, I believe that if we hold to the standards of fingerprinting, we will make sure that we are dealing without having to worry about false identities.
So you say that we have to make sure that we identify us and don't have any false identities.
I'm saying that fingerprinting will be a step to assuring that we do not have false identities out there.
Would your bill help them recover attorney fees to correct when the state police is wrong?
That is not addressed in here. Fingerprints don't lie, sir.
On page 12 of your bill, it creates a new fund, the State Police Revocation Enforcement Fund.
Yes.
But then on page 13, it provides that the money may be used to hire and train state police officers and other law enforcement purposes. Why is there a conflict there?
That's the language that came from the state police. That is so that they can go and have local law enforcement assist them on revocations.
But why doesn't the language say that? It specifically says to hire and train state police officers and other law enforcement purposes.
So they might be hiring additional personnel, and that is why that language is the way it is.
So the next question, and it's going to look like my last question here, is we talked about the 1968 five-year FOIA bill and the $5 or
Representative
$10.
Skilcorn, your time has expired.
May I finish this question?
No. Representative Walsh? Walsh
Will the sponsor you?
indicates she will.
Just one quick question. I got a phone call from DNR and from our former colleague, Representative Costello, concerning some dollars that they received from FOID card. And just wondering if that issue has been addressed.
Thank you, Representative, for bringing that. Yes, it has been addressed. What we have done is we have gone and put into the budget to make them whole for this year the money that they would have gotten on FOID cards, so we made sure that, and I have made a commitment to Director Costello that I will be working with him over the summer to find a continual source of revenue for him. It will not necessarily be from the FOID card, but I will be working with him to make sure that we have that so we can continue to keep them whole.
So we will have a trailer bill in the veto session?
It won't
regarding
necessarily be a trailer bill, but there will be some, hopefully there will be some piece of legislation that we'll work through to keep the conservation police funding whole.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Representative Villa.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the bill. As you have heard today, on February 15th, 2019, Aurora, Illinois joined a list of cities that has been steadily growing for years in the United States. It is an infamous list, a list that nobody wants to join. Aurora became a city victimized by senseless gun violence, victimized by senseless death, deaths caused by serious omissions in our gun violence prevention laws. On February 15th, 2019, at Henry Pratt Company, an employee killed 5 people and injured 6 others. The shooter had a felony conviction and still obtained a FOID card. When he was denied a concealed carry license, his FOID card was revoked, but still he did not surrender his firearm, and there was no additional follow-up. Several days after the shooting, I received a call from one of my constituents, a gentleman who was in the room when it happened. He told me the story of his experience and urged me to work on strengthening our gun laws. This gentleman was a gun dealer and knew our existing laws were flawed. We must do more to protect the people of this state from senseless gun violence by criminals. We must do more to protect our school children from the fear that invades their lives. There are dangerous gaps in the state law that allows this shooter and which will allow future criminals easy access to guns. We can do more. We must do better. This bill addresses gaps in the background check system and helps ensure that people with violent criminal histories are prohibited from gun possession. I urge a yes vote.
Representative Connor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Indicates she will.
Representative, given the situation that happened in Aurora, can you please explain to this body if there is anything in legislation or state police regulations at this point that would prevent another individual from going in, doing the exact same thing the Aurora shooter did, and obtaining a FOID and going out and legally purchasing a firearm here in Illinois?
Under current legislation, under current statute, unfortunately, there is not. It is all permissive.
Thank you. To the bill. Just to quickly reference a reference from another representative, the right to travel was recognized by the federal courts as a fundamental right in 1823 under Corfield versus Coryell. In addition, I'd like to make the point that the right to the word privacy does not appear in the Bill of Rights, and yet we recognize that as well. So fundamental rights are not limited to specific language from the founders of this country, and fingerprints didn't exist in 1789. When you go to the happiest place on earth, Disney World, you scan your fingerprints. And we can't do as well as they can do at Disney World to protect the citizens of Illinois. So I would ask this body, since there's no other way to prevent this from happening right now, let's pass this legislation today, because if Disney World can do it to protect the people who go there, we most certainly can do it to protect the citizens of Illinois. Thank you.
Representative Meyer.
Yes, I have a couple questions. Will the sponsor yield?
She indicates she will.
Down in our area, we have a lot of shooting matches put on by KC clubs, fire departments, different groups. If somebody wants to borrow somebody's gun for that, they would have to first go 3 days and put it and do a transfer?
No, for a borrowing, that does not require it. It's only for a transfer of ownership.
Some people tell me they believe that a transfer is when you take that gun from your hands and you put it in somebody else's.
Well, that is not correct according to the law. Page 25 of the bill, line 15, will clarify that for you, sir.
Okay, what about our people that can't produce a fingerprint? What will we do with them?
Everybody can produce a fingerprint.
No, ask the state police, because several years I've carried a bill here so that I could try to get a bus driver. Because of a medical condition, she has no fingerprints. We have a state rep in this building right now who cannot produce a fingerprint. So my school bus driver was never allowed to drive a school bus again. The state police cannot get a fingerprint anyway from her. So will our people who are like this be denied their constitutional rights?
Well, they would have to do their best effort to make sure that they would scan whatever they have on their fingers, and if it is not doable, that would not necessarily be the reason to prevent them from getting a FOID card if they made every attempt to do that.
Well, the state police determines right now, as they've said in committee, for the school bus driver, that they cannot, she cannot get a permit to drive the school bus because she doesn't have fingerprints. So what's the difference?
What percentage of citizens in the state of Illinois do you think that actually would affect? That sounds like an awful strange anomaly to me.
It shouldn't matter, but you know, there's 118 in this building right now, in this room, and one of them can't do it. So already we've said 1 out of 118 out of our colleagues here would not be able to get a conceal and carry, a FOID card right now.
Well, the other 7 states that do this haven't seen this as an issue or a problem.
Maybe Illinois is unique because I know several people with this, and I believe they have a constitutional right to have a FOID card. What about, we know this is going to be challenged. What about the fact that where is this money going to go? If this is going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, will this money be refunded with interest to everybody that was forced to pay it and forced to get the fingerprints?
Sir, with your argument like that, there are many bills that many people would say could be challenged, so why do we bother to pass legislation? Because anybody could challenge anything at any time.
Well, if I'm paying for something that I find out I was forced to do illegally, I would expect a refund. I would expect my legislators to go out there and fight for the fact that we get this money back because we've already paid taxes on this money. It's our money, and we're being forced to do something that the Constitution says we don't have to.
You wanted a response to that?
Well, I'd just like to know that, you know, if this is found unconstitutional, I'd like to know if this money will be returned.
That would probably have to be part of the lawsuit, and since I'm not a lawyer, I could not tell you that.
And do you not believe, because the biggest thing I have in my office, I get more calls right now on people's FOID cards and the fact of how long they can call for a month straight and never get an answer with this department. You know, they are way far behind. I'm not seeing where things are being sped up in this bill to help people with their FOID cards. They may have their middle initial misspelled on their FOID card and they can't get it. But you know, we can't service what we're trying to do right now, and you're putting more restrictions out there.
Representative, that is actually one of the main reasons why we have increased the cost behind FOID cards. So that is one of the main reasons the state police say they oftentimes run into slow processing. They do not have the money and the resources to speed up the process. This is the goal of this, to help for that basic beginning process to make it go faster and more streamlined. I too get calls in my office all the time on it, and I too would like to speed up process for lawful gun owners.
Well, I
Representative,
just believe...
your time is drawing to a close, but I believe Representative Bourne seeks to yield her time to you, so 5 more minutes.
Maybe I've missed something here, but I've seen where these funds are going. I don't see funds specific for the state police to increase this. You say we're going to maybe take care of it.
It's in the Firearms Services Fund. That's where that comes from.
We've got it in black and white. It should be part of this bill that they will be caught up and able to do the job they're supposed to do. We constantly ask our state police to put their lives on the line for us and protect us, and we don't give them extra funds. I believe the money from this should be used to make sure that when you go out and you a constitutional right guaranteed to us by the United States of America, and we challenge that, and then we can't produce a FOID card in less than a month or 2 months, we can't even have anybody answer the phone in over a month. I believe we have to do something about that now before we start putting more things on that. We need to be looking at this year's budget, doing that tomorrow. It was put into the law a few years ago, and we aren't taking care of that right now. So I think we need to take care of that first.
Representative, I hope when it comes time to vote on the budget so that we can adequately fund the state police, that you'll give us a yes vote on that.
We'll have to negotiate that budget. It seems like we're not doing much negotiation on that budget right now. Thank you.
Representative Wilhour.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Will the sponsor yield?
She will.
Representative Willis, do you believe that firearm ownership is a right or a privilege?
I think it is a right with a responsibility behind it.
Well, I appreciate you at least acknowledging that we're dealing with a legitimate constitutional right here, because when we're dealing with constitutional rights, we should avoid at all costs undue burdens on exercising those rights. And I would just like to read really quickly into a record the brief exchange between Senator Harman and then Senator Kwame Raoul from April 10th, 2014 in regards to an amendment to the Illinois Constitution prohibiting voter ID laws. Senator Harman, Senator, in a court challenge involving one of these voting laws or procedures, would the law or procedure be subject to strict scrutiny or simply rational basis review? And in response, Senator Raoul, the law and procedure at issue would be subject to strict scrutiny in a court challenge. Representative Willis, this bill requires fingerprints from everyone who applies for a FOID card or a concealed carry. Is that correct?
Yes, it does.
In Illinois, one must have a FOID card to possess a firearm. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Does your bill anticipate that gun owners or prospective gun owners will find a private party vendor, pay them for fingerprints, and then have them submit it to the state police?
That is the intent of the bill. That is the way it is drafted, yes.
In 2014, this body passed House Joint Resolution Constitutional Amendment number 52 that prevented the enactment of a voter ID law. You voted for that, Representative, and many of the folks in here voted for that. Do you remember that?
I do.
I'd like to read an additional portion of the debate from Senator Raoul, who is obviously now Attorney General Raoul, in 2014. He said, "It should be noted that 11% of U.S. citizens lack a photo ID. Of that, 18% of Americans aged 65 and older do not have a government-issued photo ID, and citizens earning less than $25,000 per year are more than twice as likely to lack a photo ID. And 25% of the voting age African Americans do not have a photo ID." Representative, are you familiar with accurate biometrics?
I am.
Yeah, they're one of the largest fingerprinting vendors in Illinois. They're registered and approved by the state of Illinois. I want to read a couple things from their website on the directions for getting fingerprinted in order to comply with the concealed carry law. It's a two-step process. Number one is print and complete the fingerprint authorization form. And number two, and this is a big one, bring this complete form and a government-issued photo ID to an accurate biometrics fingerprint location. Given these statements, clearly Senator Raoul, now Attorney General Raoul, many of the folks in here, including most likely you, Representative Willis, believe that this was too much of an imposition on the right to vote. It was unduly burdensome to the ability to carry out a legitimate constitutional right. Considering this position, how is it not an inappropriately high imposition for them to have a photo ID in order to get fingerprinted, to get a FOID card for their right to own a firearm?
Well, I'm going to quote from a court decision that says, "For the foregoing reason, we believe the district has adduced substantial evidence from which it reasonably could conclude that fingerprinting and photographing registrants will directly and materially advance public safety by preventing at least some ineligible individuals from obtaining weapons, and more important, by facilitating identification of the owner of a registered firearm during any subsequent encounter with the police. Therefore, these requirements are not unconstitutional. Those requirements are therefore not unconstitutional." I'd also further state that nobody died from voting. That's not necessarily the same from being on the wrong side of a firearm.
Representative, your time has expired, but Representative Spain, do you wish to yield your time?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wish to yield my time to Representative Wilhauer.
5 more minutes.
Thank you. I'll just go to the bill. Clearly, there's a double standard here. We can't pick and choose which part of the Constitution we uphold. Guns are they're part of American culture. The right to bear arms is a fundamental constitutional right. Laws like these laws, they're counterproductive. They don't take guns out of the hands of criminals. Criminals, by the very nature, they don't respect laws. They don't value laws. What we should be talking about in this assembly is why people are committing these acts in higher numbers than ever before. Americans have always had access to firearms, but it's only in the last couple decades that this has really become an epidemic. This is a mental health issue. A segment of our society is, they're sick. But why aren't we asking why? Why aren't we dealing with that? Is it because as a society that we've devalued life in our culture? Is it because we allow and promote our kids sitting in front of these video games where they're encouraged to blow each other's heads off? I don't know. I don't think that you do either. But do we care? Why aren't we focusing on that? Maybe we should focus on how we keep people safe in gun-free zones, because that's where most of the crimes are committed. This bill does very little of either of that. What it does do is it makes it more onerous, more burdensome for law-abiding citizens to exercise a legitimate constitutional right. I'd ask this body to stop the political opportunism, deal with real issues. We are not dealing with the real issues here. It will not take the guns out of hands of criminals, and I ask us to respect the Constitution and vote no on this blatant government overreach.
Representative Swanson is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the bill. I'm fortunate today, as I look at my FOID card, and I just got a new one, so I've got 9 more years to go at least before I have to worry about another expense on my FOID card. What I'd like to talk about, though, are some numbers. When we talk about the second and third order effect of our types of legislation we pass through the House. As I understand it, there's 2.3 million FOID cards out there today. And I bet if I asked this House, how many of your legislative aides back home receive a call Monday through Friday requesting assistance on their FOID card? I know in my district I get at least 3 to 5 calls a week, someone who needs help with a FOID card. And most of these FOID cards are 10 years old. Now let's look at rolling 2.3 million FOID cards back to a 5-year license. Now we're looking at almost 500,000 cards that are going to be due every year. So we'll be able to take that 3 to 5 phone calls a day or a week to 6 to 10 calls a week. And that's just our offices. We have 118 different offices. But let's take it down to the Illinois State Police. I've gotten to be very close and talk pretty much every day with the person who works at the state police who helps with the FOID card and the CCL issues. If we look at 2.3 million FOID cards, or 500,000 cards per year renewed, that's 221 cards every hour of an 8-hour day per year that's going to be required to renew, or 1,770 per day. The numbers are phenomenal when we start looking at what we're going to create for our Illinois State Police, but yet we don't have the budget increase to increase the manpower. So now we're bottlenecking our constitutional rights to access to something that I don't believe is constitutional to begin with. Most of those phone calls I receive are from the elderly people at that. You know, that we can't access it to the computer, or I need help, and we work with these individuals closely to help get their FOID cards. So I just bring that to everyone's attention, that those of us in the office today who help with individuals requiring a FOID card renewal, that our workload is going to increase 2 times as many as what the state police is. So thank you very much.
Representative Bailey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To the bill.
Please proceed.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to speak on behalf of the 109th District and much, if not all, of Southern Illinois. During my time here, I continue to try to hone in my skills on being a good legislator, being a good representative. I've talked to many people that I respect and have learned from, and I've developed 4 principles for deciding, for helping me to know how to vote. Number one, I asked myself, does it restrict personal freedom? Number two, I asked, does it raise or lower taxes? Number three, I asked, does it regulate business? And number four, does it make the scope of government larger or smaller? All four of these, which I believe are what it takes to make a good government and to allow these United States to thrive. So as I consider this, I look at number one and I ask myself, does this restrict personal freedom? Well, I believe that fingerprints are obviously an intrusion on our privacy. I believe that people in general don't trust government with their money, with what we're doing here most of the time. Maybe we need fingerprinted here since we're handling so much money. Number two, does it raise or lower taxes? All session long, on almost every bill that we've been talking about, I've heard a lot of concern about those who are less fortunate in this state. We are creating a system that is going to take, of the over 2.6 million FOID card holders, an additional $67 million over the next 10 years. Additional on top of the current FOID cost. Number three, I asked myself, does it regulate business? Well, SB 337 was signed into law in January, and it forces new regulations on the over 2,000 FFL dealers. New fees were originated. We were told that a minimum fee of $300 would be charged and a maximum fee of $1,500 per dealer would be charged. So far, every one of my dealers in the 109th District, many of which literally operate out of their homes, have got on the internet as they received their letters. They filled out the form, and guess what? To no surprise, every one of them are falling into the $1,300 category. Over a 10-year period, this is going to take an additional $8 million from the over 2,000 FFL dealers in Illinois. So ask yourself that, are we regulating business? Number four, does this make the scope of government less or greater? Well, that's the biggest problem that I have. Government does not need our fingerprints. They don't need the fingerprints of a law-abiding citizen. I'm curious where to find the facts of the many crimes that have been committed throughout our state, especially in the Aurora area. How many of those people who committed these crimes had a FOID card? Government needs to hold government accountable to do what we ask them to do here. This bill is a total and complete infringement of the Second Amendment and the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution. Yesterday, I sat here and I listened as many of you invited people from neighboring states to come to Illinois and get an abortion. What on earth is going to keep anyone from bringing a gun across the state lines? I do not understand that. I do not get that. Bad people are going to do bad things, and it's high time that we start punishing those bad people for doing bad things in an appropriate way instead of burdening our citizenry. Everything about this is wrong, friends. I've been saying that several times this week. This is not right. This bill creates a financial burden on Illinois families. It infringes on the very freedoms that make this country the most awesome country in the world. Friends, I'm afraid that the passage of this bill is going to take this state to places that we don't want to go. We are here to figure out problems. And instead, time after time and after time again, we believe that throwing money at the problems and creating more regulation is the answer. It's not the answer. Let's deal with the problem. Please, let's deal with the problem. Thank you so much.
Representative Cabello.